All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another live stream hosted by Grand Strand Action Together. I'm Ashlyn, and I have two of our interns with me tonight. I have Sydney.
Hello.
And we have Brynne. And we are going to be talking to two sociology professors from Coastal Carolina University, Jaime McCauley and Matt Wilkinson. I won't tell you what his nickname is, but he does have one of those. So I just want to let them introduce themselves to you all, and everyone here should just know that I'm super embarrassing. So Matt, just don't be surprised that you're going to be embarrassed. Go ahead, Sid. Why don't you go first?
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Sydney, like she just said. But I'm a senior here at Coastal Carolina. I'm a sociology major. I'm interning with GSAT, and I'm just going to be working on projects with them, like the Humankind Project. We're doing the march, the abortion justice rally. Sorry. And yeah, I'm just excited to help out and learn more about our community.
Thank you. Brynne, why don't you go next and tell everyone about yourself?
Okay, hello, my name is Brynne, obviously, sorry. And I am a junior at Coastal. I'm a communication major with a minor in music and global studies and a certificate in sustainability. And I'm just here with GSAT to help Myrtle Beach become, better, obviously. Well, personally, I think it would be better with our views, but that's a personal opinion. I'll be doing Instagram, pictures, blogs, emails, press releases, just stuff like that. So, yeah.
Thank you. We're so excited to have both of you with us. And now on to our lovely guests. So we will start with Jaime, because beauty before brains, I guess.
I'm Jaime McCauley. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at Coastal, and my areas of expertise include social inequality, environmental sociology, and I have worked a little bit in the area of science, technology, and society, so there's some overlap in the research work that I've done, which is what brought me here to this talk tonight in terms of looking at why people might distrust scientific experts and lead them to do their own online research.
All right, Matt, go ahead. It is your turn, sir.
Hi, I'm Matt Wilkinson. I'm back for the third or fourth time. Ashlyn has me on retainer. I'm a paid consultant, 1 cup of coffee per month or whenever I see her in person.
Like a cup of coffee.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I'm owed lots of coffee.
You are.
My areas of expertise and research are violence and aggression. I teach in the kind of criminology area concentration in our program over at Coastal Carolina. I teach sociological theory, juvenile delinquency. So my interests are in kind of deviance and crime, and also political sociology and kind of how we rally around our tribes and our flags, and how information can be disseminated through these groups for better or for worse. So that's why I'm here.
All right. Well, we are super excited, really, really excited for this discussion. So that kind of plays into a past talk we had with Matt, where we went over conspiracy theories, which, leads into the concept and culture, I guess, now on the internet of, internet experts of whatnot. Lots of different things. Right now, it seems to be, since we're in a pandemic, that COVID is like the hot topic. Everyone thinks they know what's best, if they have a degree or not. They don't trust, our public health experts, the scientists. And while I think there are some valid reasons there are some not so valid reasons. And our two experts will go ahead and get into that. So our first question is, obviously there have been people who have propped themselves up as, experts in fields that they're not experts in, right? Before social media even existed. Very clearly, it has created more visibility for what I will call grifters and snake oil salesmen, to spread their misinformation and to spread their propaganda. So I guess I just want to know, can you talk about what changes you may have seen in your areas of study from like before even like AOL until now?
Paper, rock, scissors. Jaime,
Yeah, no, I can go. So I think you're right that this is not a new phenomenon. And they're like the idea of like trust versus distrust and people emerging as experts and kind of taking on an expertise that they don't necessarily have. You can find examples, from very far back. In terms of recent history, certainly access to the internet and access to information, just having, being able to like type in an instant and have this world of information at your fingertips certainly makes it easier for people to pass themselves off as experts when they are not. An important distinction for me is that, we also have had examples of, and I'll go back to the 1980s and 1990s and the debates around smoking and whether or not smoking cigarettes was bad for you. Now in 2021, like this is a pretty accepted fact, right? Like you will find very few people in this day and age to say, oh no, smoking's totally fine. But at that point in time, and I was old enough to remember, like I was still pretty young, but I'm old enough to remember like seeing on TV, like actual literal doctors, MDs, like going up in court cases and saying, oh no, smoking's totally fine. Like there's not a direct link to cancer. You can easily find vintage ads where, doctors are recommending the health benefits of a particular brand of cigarette over another. So I think, one of the distinctions for me is that it's not just, random people going online and then passing themselves off as experts. It's that you can find actual experts. Now they're in the minority and they're challenging the scientific consensus, but you have someone who's willing to challenge the consensus. So for people who are seeking that perspective and they're seeking that information, they're like, here's one. And another good example is climate change, where 97% of scientists that study climate change agree climate change is happening and it is human caused, but you can find one or two maybe who are challenging it. It's more rare to find them these days. But what you see a lot in the media though, is that phenomenon where people are passing themselves off as experts and they're not, where the media is trying to be balanced. So they have a scientific expert on talking about climate change, and then they have like a blogger who is saying, like against climate change. So we live in a world where both of these phenomenon are converging. But I know on my Facebook, I was watching family members post, one particular doctor or, another, with just a couple particular doctors, or someone recently posted an open letter from the state that I used to work in Kentucky. And, he was against the mask mandate at the university that I used to work at. And he was like, oh, well, here's a letter and it's signed by, 20 health professionals, but they were ophthalmologists and podiatrists and people who are not working in infectious disease. But for, the average person, doing that next step in the research can be challenging. So there are a lot of factors I see converging. And then of course, all of this filtered through social media, where before you were seeing this, in your morning or evening newspaper, maybe in the evening or nightly news, watching these debates play out. And now it's just like constant information that you have to sort through. And it can be overwhelming for people to try to figure out what's real and what's not.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Jumping off what Jaime said, I think that, and every time I have similar talks or give similar talks or have conversations about these sorts of topics, I always try to bring it back to, I think there's two subgroups when we start talking about misinformation. And Jaime mentioned, one of them, which is there are people who are capitalizing by creating doubt. And, the merchants of doubt, going way back to where let's try to muddy the waters. And when you combine that with a populace or citizenry that lacks the tools to work through this information and sort good from bad, you have kind of a recipe for chaos. And all of this is accelerated by easy access of the information online. And we'll get into some of the logical fallacies and stuff later. But, you're looking for something that confirms what you believe, and you can find it easily with just a few quick strokes into Google. Boom, there it is. That makes me feel good. That's what I wanted to hear. I am reassured. And that's a relatively new phenomenon. It's been just really accelerated over the last few years. People have been bored because of the pandemic, so they're sitting at home. They're angry at society. They need someone to blame. And then here's these merchants of doubt serving it up to them on a platter. Mm-hmm. So, I think that we can get into how we respond to it later on in this talk. But that first group, the people who are preying on those who don't know as much as they think they do, like this is their time in the spotlight. They're having a field day manipulating everyday individuals and kind of reaping the rewards, as we've seen with with political movements, with the Capitol riots, people who are now in prison or facing charges because they believed a big lie, and they just waltzed right in there thinking they were in the right. And it's hard for us to understand being on the outside. But anyway, I'll pass the baton. Who wants to talk next?
I would just jump in and say too, like the algorithms, right?
Yes.
So it's not just that people are, I'm going to do my own research, which they might be doing in good faith, right? And I teach critical thinking. Like it's important to question, and we should not unquestionably trust our institutions, but we have to, approach doing our own research in good faith and be able to have access to good information. And then you're on sites like even Google and which, YouTube was always kind of a mess.
Right.
Even Google, which we used to kind of trust to get a good range of responses. Google's, giving you stuff based on algorithms. Mm-hmm. So you're not necessarily Google's telling you what you want to hear too. So it's all reinforcing that confirmation bias. So you're going to find, things that reinforce what you already believe based on those algorithms.
Well, how many people do you think are actually looking for, because no one's doing their own research, which both of you know, they're not actually participating in research. They're reading other people's research, which most likely was just put in an article or a blog post. But was that cherry picked? How many people actually read a peer-reviewed research study from PubMed? And even if they do, my husband has a science degree, so I have looked at some abstracts, but I haven't read further down than the abstracts.
Right.
So I just I'm here, Kyle, you read this and then let me know what this says. And I don't know, that's not, I feel like you can cherry pick any of the study to put what you want it to say.
Yeah, and here's part of the problem with that. We, scientists and social scientists and academics, are to blame for part of this because we long ago started writing in a language that only we speak, and speaking to our peers and trying to publish in journals that are only read by other academics just so we can get a check mark that says that we got a publication. We've removed our voices from public life, which allows others to creep in and, like I said, prey on those who don't know any better. So we have people who, it feels good to try to find things out on your own instead of just believing what you're told. That's healthy. Skepticism is healthy. But when people jump online and they can't sort good information from bad information, and they're kind of doing science in reverse. They don't start with a question and investigate it. Show me studies that support that vaccines cause autism. They will find information, not studies, that might support it, and they will ignore everything else. And then the other problem, of course, is that Jaime alluded to, is this false balance. There's two sides. Mm-hmm. And I was going to try to throw it up in the chat. There was a great episode of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver where he had a climate change debate. And they had, I think it was Bill Nye and someone were debating about climate change. And then John Oliver says, well, to make it more accurate, we're going to bring out, 97% of scientists agree, 3 scientists who support this side, and they brought out 97 other people. So you had both sides of the debate. Uh-huh. One overwhelming scientific consensus, and that visual is pretty remarkable because you go, all right, this isn't even a debate. It's not a fair fight. The evidence is on this one side. but it gets reduced down to, well, there's two sides to this.
Yeah.
You know, it's a pro-con debate. Let's hear from both sides. And the media is at fault as well for just presenting it as theater, as one side, you know, two teams competing without
Right.
proper weighting.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's a challenge for the media too, though. And I put in the chat, there's an academic article, which I'll return to the trouble with academic articles as well, called Balance as Bias by Boykoff and Boykoff. And it's somewhat older now, but at the point I think still stands. So if anyone's interested in academic research on this phenomenon, it's about climate change. And you know, like how they want to present both sides, but there's not necessarily, you know, there's really not another side, like especially now. It's happening, and you know, like we've, you know, pissed around for 30 years, and now we're in an increasing crisis. But the media knows that people are chomping at the bit to blame them for being biased. So they approach that by saying both sides, both sides, both sides. And there's, you know, a quote that I see online, which I did not fact check, but somebody, you know, was talking about, like, I think it was like their journalism professor or something that says, you know, like if somebody says it's raining, it's not your job to report. Somebody says it's raining and somebody says it isn't. It's your job to look out the window and look and see if it's raining, right? So it's your job to like assess and analyze that information. But of course, in this, you know, in our intense political climate where the media is already under fire, they know if they don't present both sides, you know, then they're going to be criticized. So I think, you know, like there's a challenge for them as well. But I think the point about academic articles is that reading and digesting and understanding academic journal articles is a skill that takes years to really get to. And I agree that, you know, we as academics shoulder some blame for that. I mean, you know, of course, like we're in a system by which, you know, in which that's how we get promoted, is by publishing in those mediums and writing for that audience. But, you know, this is what we see, Matt, in our research sequence, you know, like when I get students in 201 and they're starting out with a research question, like one, they think they're writing an argumentative paper, that they're picking a side and making an argument, and then they're presenting both sides of that argument, and then, you know, choosing the side that they like.
Yeah.
And that's how they have been trained, right? Like that's, you know, they're used to writing persuasive papers. So a lot of my time in that class is saying, no, we're writing a different kind of paper. All you're doing is summarizing this work. Well then, you know, and let's be honest, I mean, I don't always read the entirety of all of the academic papers that I work with either. I read beyond the abstract. Introduction, discussion, conclusion, right? Will mostly give you what you need, unless you know, there's a reason I need to get really in depth in it. And you know, this is the stuff I like to nerd out on. So I can't blame some people for checking out. But you know, like our students, and I think most lay people, especially people that don't necessarily have the benefit of a college education or have been in an environment where they've been forced to like really practice this skill, you know, there's to know what it means to have controlled for different variables. That, you know, when we look at kids in divorce, like, well, yes, like kids in divorce do sometimes struggle with depression or anxiety, but that is in the context of a very specific phenomenon. There are other variables that mitigate that. That doesn't last forever. It doesn't mean they're, you know, that this is something they deal with for the rest of their life. There's a difference in whether the marriage is high conflict or not. And we don't have a whole lot of data on what is the impact on children for parents who stayed in marriages that they should not have been in and didn't want to be.
Exactly.
Right. But those skills take time. And by saying that, I'm not saying our skills are necessarily more valuable than any other skills. Those are just the skills that we have that are utilizable in different ways. And, you know, because I don't want us to seem like we're all high and mighty and, you know, we're the best because these are the skills that we have. You know, like my dad has other skills, you know, like he can do many things that I can't do, you know, like other people have other skills, but that's the skill that I have.
Yeah.
And it's a skill that not a lot of people have because they're busy learning other skills that contribute to the world in a different way.
I mean, and that's where we
yeah.
are now, is that these skills matter now more than ever because there's so much deliberate misinformation out there that's designed to manipulate people into supporting harmful actions, and supporting conspiracy theories that essentially make them non-playable characters in the whole political debate. They're just sidelined because they're off chasing something that's not real. And these people, and I've said this in some of the other talks, they are 100% victims in this because they truly do not realize that they're being manipulated. And I don't say that from an elitist standpoint that, oh, I'm so wise because I have a PhD. I am fortunate and privileged and blessed that I have the skills that I do from my training, because it's easier with a scientific mind to sort through some of this. And there's research on this that shows not just people with credentials, but someone who subscribes to the scientific mind is less susceptible to conspiracy theories. I have friends who are, mechanics and police officers and philosophers, and all who subscribe to the scientific mind, and they sort through it. It's not just a bunch of people in an ivory tower going, "Oh, all the regulars out there don't get it." Mm-hmm. And this is a good opportunity to talk about Dunning-Kruger, because I know Ashlyn had initially reached out. And some of you might be familiar with this, and I won't go all, sage on the stage here, but I think this is important. So these were psychologists, I believe in the 90s, who did some research that showed that, and it's kind of like, it's the confidence and arrogance of the uninformed is the best way to put it. And the uninformed are more confident than those who are educated or those who have experience, because they fail to recognize their own lack of knowledge. They fail to recognize the extent of their own ignorance. And so they also can't accurately or adequately gauge the expertise of others. So this kind of sets them up to fail. And this is why you see people, to reverse it, telling someone how they should be policing when they don't understand some of the, telling a police officer how you should do this when I don't understand what they deal with on the street. I don't have knowledge of what it's like to be on the streets policing. And if I were to assume, I don't have that knowledge, and it works in the other direction as well. So on some level, you can't blame these people because it's not their fault. I think that's important to remember. And then when you add in to Dunning-Kruger that our society, that a lot of these people have been slowly conditioned to just like shut out or totally ignore anything that suggests an alternative viewpoint. We've been, given this great label of fake news, right? If you don't like it, fake news, ignore it. So now they're just charging forward with this. The end is already set, and they're moving and you can't knock them off their path, because I know this, I'm confident in this, and they don't realize their own folly, really. And I mean, it's kind of like a, locomotion out of control. It's on the tracks. We've lost control of it. I don't know how to hit the brakes.
Mm-hmm. I would say too, there's, a falsehood or misinformation or even an outright lie. Those things don't gain traction unless there's some element of truth that it connects to.
Yeah.
So, and this is where for me things get complicated, and they should be complicated. Otherwise, like, we fall into the same trap of really looking at things from a simplistic way. And, and part of, like what I'm bringing in here tonight is, like my background working in citizen science and or community science. And if you're not familiar, I mean, these are scenarios where people partner with scientific experts to produce their own data. So sometimes this happens in places where there is a strong distrust of the government, and there is a strong distrust in corporations. So Flint, Michigan is a good example, right? So, and my point is, like, there are good reasons for people to distrust science and experts sometimes because they have fucked up. And we know that, right? Because science is political. Like, it's not entirely objective. Like, we know that. And I've been saying that for years. And now I'm like, listen to science, but also, like, we know. So, and like, part of like, this is like, okay, like, for me being a person who is hesitant to trust institutions, what is it now? And like, now it's like, I see hundreds and thousands of people dying. And I'm like, okay, like, this is the best information we have. if I had an opportunity, I would have signed up for like to be in a vaccine test. I was like I am young-ish. I don't have any risk factors. I'm otherwise healthy. Like, let me do what I can to save other people. That means getting a vaccine, or being in medical research, fine. But the grain of truth is, we know that sometimes science is wrong. Sometimes our scientific experts do not have our best interests. Sometimes our government officials do not have our best interests at heart. So Flint, people in Flint, like the everyday person, they knew their water was messed up. All you had to do was look at it. You could see it. They had health issues from it. They knew what was happening. The EPA, their city council, the state officials, the governor, Barack Obama went there and drank the water and said, "Oh, the water's fine."
Pretended.
They gave him the good water.
Yes.
No, I think he pretended. I really do. In that documentary on Netflix,
Oh,
there's no way his lips opened. They did not.
Oh, they said, "Don't drink the water." Here's your photo op.
But we know, right? And we have all seen that happen. We all watched that unfold. So we know. But the difference in what happened in Flint was everyday people, like the people living there, partnered with Mark Edwards, who was a scientific expert from University of Virginia, who had done work in Washington, D.C., and that's how people knew him. So that's the difference with citizen science or community science, is that there's a partnership with a scientific expert that occurs in real time and in communication. And there are a number of examples of this. A lot of the citizen science programs are different. They're not all like contentious. Many people, want to partner with the government, and so there's a lot of complications, but Flint is a really good example, both of how science and government experts fail us, but also how we can mobilize science to our own gain. But for people who are outside of that don't have access to, like real scientific experts, like in their life that they can talk to, like rather than pulling, snips here and there from the internet or what my friends are sharing or whatever, like that's not the same as really being embedded in the scientific research process, like as you are in citizen science. So I think, my point is, there are good reasons for this distrust.
Yeah. And what you pointed out, which I think is really important distinction, is individuals who know something's wrong because in their daily lives, they know the water is polluted and someone's saying it's fine. And as a group, they mobilize and come together for like a collective action and say something is wrong, versus what we're also seeing happening, which is people become paranoid because they read something on the internet, which was generated by, in some cases, propaganda from Russian trolls or some sort of, campaign from another country to undermine stability in our own country, or from merchants of doubt or purveyors of conspiracy theories like Alex Jones or political candidates in order to manipulate people. And so they're taking their cue of paranoia from up top instead of what they actually experience in their day-to-day lives. So that's an interesting split. And one thing, talking about the rates at which people are dying, and I don't know if I put this up in the chat earlier. I forgot who did this, but I'll try to find it. Someone did an analysis of, I think it's at the county level, of vaccination rates and then also deaths per 100,000, I believe, to COVID. And they did the analysis by percent of vote of Trump versus Biden. So this has finally been done. I think it was out. Here's my notes. It should be in here. I feel like it was.
Found it in the Google Doc. Yeah, let me see.
Yeah, it's Johns Hopkins, I think, was where the data were coming out of. And so this is, I never thought I would see something as concrete in my lifetime as this. Currently, for every one Democrat or liberal, I forgot how they define it politically, death to COVID, there are 5 conservative or Republican deaths. So we're talking about this inequality that's all because of a decision not to get the vaccine, because of paranoia and fear and misinformation. And when you look at the graph, I found the graph, in counties that have 90 to 100% vote for Trump, they have 55 deaths per 100,000. Versus counties that had 0 to 10% vote for Trump, 5 deaths. We're talking 10 times the amount in these deep red rural areas. And we can work backwards and figure out why. And, as soon as Fauci contradicted Trump on national television, that was the end. Because the people who supported their side, you know, their leader, started finding ways to undermine him, and it became this like oppositional collective movement. If he says jump, we're going to sit down. It's an opposition movement. We're not for something, we're against it. It could be summarized by the movement of nope. So when Fauci says get vaccinated, we're not doing it. Fauci says get, Moderna is great, we're going to do ivermectin. It's defined totally in opposition. And we've seen this in the past. It just hasn't been so immediately, objectively evident that there's this outcome where you see people dying, literally dying, or, it's a high survival rate, surviving and having health issues and having a hospital bill, or, being having long haul COVID for 3 to 6 months because they bought into misinformation. They trusted the non-scientific outlets. So it's incredibly frustrating and more so depressing to see this happen. I just cannot believe we are at this point in our society.
I have a question for you guys.
Yeah.
What's that?
So do you think that science, like, we've created this phenomenon that it always 100% has to be correct, like science cannot be wrong, and like the media has helped that, or has that changed over time?
I think that is a good question.
Yeah.
And I like, in a way, like, I think there are a lot of scientists that come from a place of hubris.
Yes.
And arrogance. And, and I do think scientists, sure. I mean, like, even in the academic hierarchy where, like our discipline is looked down on because we're not real science, right? So like, yes, scientists, but also academics in general, like myself, like I won't put myself like outside of this critique. But, like we are often coming from a place of arrogance. And if it's not intentional, like, again, the difference between intention and impact, even if it's not intentional, we can present ourselves that way. And, and I think, like, again, like my discipline is not necessarily like that overall, but in my personal interactions, I know I have to be careful because like my tone, like can come across that way. And I'm like, no, but I know the research. Let me tell you. And like, that's not what's going to convince the person. Like, you have to listen to them and understand them and acknowledge, like Sydney, when we were talking the other day, I mentioned, like my niece who is a nurse and is struggling to decide whether or not she's going to get the vaccine because she comes from a family that is extremely right-wing conservative. Now, like where like Fox News now is too liberal for them, and that's not where they get their sources from, and it's OAN. And one time my partner tried to share some information it was a research study from Harvard, and my niece, her mom, was like, well, you can't trust that because it's from Harvard and they're liberal.
Right.
So here's this young person who is in her early 20s, like trying to decide if she's going to keep her job as a nurse or not, because she's struggling to decide if she's going to take the vaccine. And she asked me about it. And I think that was a big step for her because it's no secret that, I do not frequently agree with the views that she is predominantly exposed to. And I think that she was really trying to like reach out for other information. And I had to be really careful not to just be like, get the vaccine,
Yeah.
and just like really like talk through like her fears and concerns without coming across as arrogant, as though I know what's best for her. So like, that's on a personal level. And then science, like broadly defined, is frequently arrogant. Like we know the answers, and, we can't trust people to know what's best for themselves when frequently people do. And I did bring some books for show and tell. So this is The Fifth Branch by Sheila Jasanoff, who I can also share a quote from. But not in this book, but she wrote an article called The Technologies of Humility. And I think that in her argument, she's a science, technology, and society scholar, distinguished professor at Harvard, for what that's worth. And like it's an article of hers where she like calls out the arrogance of science and calls for like, being more humble and including people in science. And my other book for show and tell is Ulrich Beck's The Risk Society, which I can talk more like theoretically about. but like both of these scholars like challenge like the know-it-all-ness of science and talk about why that makes people distrust science and how some science can sometimes be wrong. And like what we need to do is like allow people to participate in science, open science up.
Yes.
So
remove the paywall.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yes.
Use
Remove the
regular
paywall.
language.
Yes,
You know?
remove the paywall and write in a way that people want to and can under. Like actually, like neither of these books are really super accessible. Honestly,
Yeah.
I mean, Beck, it's a German translation, so okay. And
Yeah.
Jasmine is like a good writer, but also like she's very smart in writing from Harvard. So I'm like, okay, let me read that sentence.
And as we were saying, in the pre-talk before this, sometimes the smartest, most intellectual people are not great at communicating to the public or even their students. And there's part of the disconnect. So they do come across as out of touch or detached and arrogant, and that creates a problem.
You both just brought up things that I wanted to touch on. And then Brynne, if you maybe want to like jump in on my questions here. So the first one is, Jaime, I wanted to bring up the what we're seeing with nurses and the misinformation that a lot of them are spewing online. Like, I don't know if y'all are on TikTok, but there is a ton of nurses who are just like, well, I'm done, lost my job because I won't get the jab, and confused. My sister's a nurse. They had to have all their vaccinations to get through nursing school. You have a science degree. How doesn't it make sense to you? And like, don't you trust the doctors that you work with? Like, I don't understand. I personally get the distrust of big pharma because I also have problems with that, but my problems are with the politicians, my problems are with the CEOs, and my problems are with the lobbyists. My problems are not with the scientists that are creating these life-saving medications. So that I just have not been able to comprehend because like pretty much doctors, there's a very overwhelming consensus from what I have seen. Nurses, on the other hand, mind blown.
I have a couple of hypotheses, some like kind of like based on like my own like assumptions and extrapolations, some based on some early, some people who are doing kind of like early stage research, like with nurses on why they might be vaccine hesitant. So one is that nurses are people like the rest of us, and they're going into their profession with the same, political beliefs, backgrounds, and everything else that we all carry forward in our lives. So for nurses who are from backgrounds where, and I'll say too, like for everyone in times of fear and uncertainty, we reach out to comfort from people around us. When we're unsure of what to do, we're like, well, what are other people like us doing? So we look to our social networks, and sometimes that means our social media networks in 2021, right? So, and that's the same thing nurses are doing, right? So when, in times of uncertainty, we're like, who do we trust? Who we think is like us? So they're following, like the same, like the leads from, the news networks and the politicians and the people that they already have trust in. So that's one. But also nurses are in a unique position in the medical field in that nurses see medicine go wrong all the time. Like they are in a position where they see doctors mess up. And it doesn't mean that that's the primary thing. I mean, they see doctors save lives too. But I think nurses are in a position where they see the fallibility of medicine more than the regular person. And there's a lot of stories, again, anecdotal, like I don't know actual like research statistics on this, but there are a lot of nurses who know doctors mess up because they're the ones who fix it.
Right.
So I think that there's really a lot of complicated stuff going on there with nurses. Also, nurses encompass, people with CNAs who have very little medical training to people with RNs who have more medical training, and there's a lot in between there. And also like nursing training doesn't necessarily, depending on the amount of training you have and the kind of training you have, doesn't necessarily mean you're trained in scientific research either. So there's a lot of complicated stuff around, I think, how nurses are processing the information. I would also say too, like based on what I understand from some of the people doing early stage research on this, it's certainly not a majority of nurses. Like the majority of nurses are like online with the vaccine and think it's fine. But there's a very vocal minority. And, and again, like back to trusting experts, for people who have a nurse in their life who is questioning the vaccine, like that's the expert that they're closest to, right? So even like my niece, I mean, she technically has more medical expertise than I do, but I'm not going to take her expertise over, like other people that I know. We also have a relative who is a doctor and a very well-established career as a surgeon who did get the vaccine and also is very politically conservative. So I hope that she reached out to him and was able to talk through things with him as well. So like that's my thought on nurses.
Brynne, put her hand up.
Sorry, I know this isn't really a class discussion, but we keep talking about how science is political, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and actually had a conversation with my mom about it. Why is the vaccination, it's become a political topic? Like most likely, in today's society, if you're a Republican, you're more susceptible to not get the vaccine rather than if you were a Democrat. Why? I don't understand how the safety of others has anything to do with a political statement. Now, do you guys have any sort of educational thing you can tell me to ease my mind about it?
So, it is complicated, and I think that the main issue is, sorry, I'm getting some background noise. Is that?
Oh, sorry, I'm in Panera, and I'll mute myself.
It's like, where's that noise coming from? I do think that some of this, and maybe Jaime can jump in with some of the citizen science framework, but I think there's been such resistance to the liberal scientists and climate change, and before that probably smoking, and before that probably seatbelt. So the machine has already been kind of set up to get on our sides with our teams waving our flags and have that battle. I think with COVID and vaccination, it really just hit overdrive. Like I said earlier, when Fauci smirked at Trump, and where some of the scientists were saying this is not true. Hydroxychloroquine is not an effective treatment. Everyone came forward and said that. And people are like, well, how do you know, scientists? You don't know anything. Like, please do not use this drug. And now ivermectin. It's that oppositional sort of movement. And I think that one thing we have to remember too is, Jaime and I were talking about this earlier, in sociology, we have this concept of reference groups. And these are groups that we essentially get our identity from. So we use them as social mirrors to reflect images back on the self. That's probably a direct quote from Cooley or something, right, Jaime? We
didn't cite him. F for the assignment, Matt.
Yeah, got to do it. It's Charles Horton Cooley and Irving Goffman. So we want to feel good about ourselves, and we want that mirror to hold up a acceptable or positive appraisal. And so when we see our tribe moving in a direction, we jump in and we play the game with them, because we don't want to be kicked off the island. We don't want to be voted out. So we jump in, we play the game, we try to outdo, with our vaccine denialism, or I don't think COVID's real. Or at the very least, we don't speak out, because, and this is where we get into the bystander effect, is that if I speak out, I might be seen as disloyal. Maybe someone else will speak out, right? Groupthink. I don't want to be seen as disloyal to the group. So not everyone truly believes that COVID is fake or that the vaccine is harmful. They're just sitting on the sidelines, kind of being quiet, because they don't want to, stick their head out for their group and have everyone turn and look at them and go, "Are you a traitor? Are you switching teams?" So it creates this, like I said earlier, kind of like this juggernaut that we can't control, because no one wants to speak up. That is changing now, only because people are literally dying. And you see these stories where they're denying COVID, and then from their deathbed, they say, "This is real, please get the vaccine." Some of them do. And there's people in that group who are now, I've seen it personally on Facebook, who are speaking out and saying, "I just lost my best friend to COVID. They denied, didn't get the vaccine. I got the vaccine, please get it," because the costs are so high. And so this is kind of, meeting the moment sort of thing. We haven't had, the stakes haven't been this high. So I'm hoping that maybe people will turn to, all right, what does the scientific consensus say? And that's the other thing, is that it always drives me crazy when people say, well, it's your opinion, or you think highly of your opinion. It's like, this is not my opinion. I'm going with this decision not because a couple scientists said it, but the overwhelming, I get so sick of saying this, the overwhelming scientific consensus says this is the best bet. Maybe in 10 years they're wrong, but right now that's the best way to make your bet, instead of going, yeah, I get that, but I'm going to go with this one guy on YouTube. Why would you live your life that way, making those bets all the time? So
honestly, I think it's because people are so lazy. Like, doing the research, like reading a research paper is hard, and reading science, like, especially somebody from
the
who comes from
language,
humanities,
don't understand it that much.
And that's
it's easy to stick to the social media.
It's easy to watch a 2-minute video rather than read a 10 to 20 page.
But also, I think we should think about too, like, where people are coming from and the reality of people's lives who are trying to make these decisions. If I was a young single mom, or even, like a person like with a very stable family, 2-parent family, but with kids and work and everything else, like, who is busy and trying to make like the best decisions, like, they don't have time to sit around reading research articles. And research articles will tell you all kinds of things. Science rarely agrees with itself. That's why 90% of scientists agreeing with climate change is a pretty big deal, because scientists generally don't agree with each other. So we're living like in COVID, it's unprecedented. Like, how many times have we heard that word? So we are living in like a time where things are going to change. So people lost trust in the CDC. So, and especially from the conservative side, where you already have a distrust of government and government agencies. And a lot of people already started from a place of distrust, but even people who didn't, lost trust in the CDC because they were like, don't wear masks. Now wear masks. Now you can stop wearing your mask. Now start wearing
this kind of mask. Not that
mask. Is something I think people don't understand, is that, like you said, sciencey people, people who are rational minded and logical thinkers, and either follow scientists, follow like actual, experts in these fields. They go off of like the best evidence that they have at the time.
At the time.
That changes. So like, when we didn't know if masks were going to work, it wasn't necessarily a suggestion, and then it was, and then we got data that showed over a couple months that it reduces the transmission.
Right.
So I think, like, I hear all the time, like, well, they said this and then they said that. And I've tried to explain, like, we had no data to go on for masks with COVID, and now we do have data to go on. So
I mean, and that's the scientific illiteracy part, is that science is a process. It's not, and we know back to we have our 2 teams, and you were wrong. That means you're a loser. Like, yes, the science, we have better data, which means that we've adjusted or changed it. And now that's the safe bet. It's not that we dug in and this is our position and, and then we were wrong. It's not opinion, it's the consensus. In some cases, there's not much consensus. And we talk about this with our students, there's mixed evidence on the effectiveness of this policy. Or, in class, we talk about the death penalty as a deterrent. There is absolutely zero evidence that the death penalty deters violent crime. That's not an opinion, that's just the evidence. And if you want to be for the death penalty on moral grounds, that's a separate argument for philosophers or religious studies or someone else. But if you're going to say we need the death penalty because it'll prevent people from killing, zero evidence that it has an impact. That's because the overwhelming amount of research and data and comparing states and that had it and then didn't have it, or had to stay on executions, tiny differences in crime, and statistically insignificant. And people on the outside of academia or science don't understand that process. And that's really frustrating.
So how do you guys think that the Biden administration and the media, have they been doing a poor job explaining COVID and the vaccine?
Can I answer this one?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is my
Can I answer after Matt?
This is my snide, sarcastic remark. So I hope this will not be taken out of context. I think that if Biden and Fauci stopped talking completely, and stopped getting in front of a camera and saying, get vaccinated, or blaming calling it a pandemic of the unvaccinated, if they stopped heaping blame and guilt, that we would within weeks start to see in rural areas vaccination ticking up, because people would feel like they had a way to kind of take an off ramp, and they wouldn't feel driven into their ideological trenches where they had to get with their team and fight against the enemy. Everything that Fauci and the medical team was saying, I'd hear it, and like, this is great, but every time he would appear on screen, I'd go, this is going to push people further. I mean, it's a crisis in science communication, because they're just saying what the consensus is. And I don't have the solution, but it seems like kind of, I don't want to say let it play out, because we know what that means. If we look at Florida, if we let it play out, people are dying. So you can't just like not say anything. But I do think if they stop talking about it, people would come around and get vaccinated. But at what cost? Go ahead, Jaime.
Yeah,
Ball to you.
No, I agree. I mean, like you said, that was going to be like sarcastic or flippant, but I honestly, I think that would be realistically a good strategy for like Biden just to like shut up and get out of the way. Like they showed him on TV, like getting his booster shot. Like anyone who supports Biden, I'm sure is thrilled to get a booster shot.
Yeah.
Like, that's
good
not convincing anybody who doesn't have a vaccine to get a vaccine.
No,
right?
it's just
That's,
it's political to
helping.
make him look like he's leading.
Because, like all of this is filtered through identities, right? So like for people who identify, like with Biden and his side, like, yeah, like that's going to be fine. But I think one of the challenges is everything feels really heavy-handed. And that is already one of the critiques of the Democratic Party and liberal politics from conservatives, that they take the role of the nanny state and they control people's behavior and they tell people what to do. So the more heavy-handed the approach is, the less effective it's going to be. And we keep talking about science communication. And again, not my primary area of expertise, but something that I've followed over the last few years in the citizen science work. A lot of people talk about science communication and that having people participate in science is actually helpful. Sure. But also like science communication, you can't just like dump facts at somebody. And even like from a social psychological perspective, like we know as frustrating as it can be, again, for me, and like, that's like me checking like my own arrogance. You can't just like check facts and like, check the statistics off. People don't care.
Right.
They care about their morals and their values and their identity. So you have to, there's nothing about vaccines in particular that are necessarily against any individual's identity or politics or morality. There's something about this vaccine right now at this point in time. And interestingly, the vaccine that was started under the Trump administration, and I wonder to what extent, like, would this potentially be reversed if we were not in a Biden administration? Because then it would be Trump's vaccine. And, many people wanted to celebrate Trump's accomplishments on the vaccine during the Trump administration. And then the election happened. And then it's like, oh, we can't take this vaccine now. And on the flip side, I think it's fair to ask, like, how many liberal people would be less trustful of the government now if it were Trump's administration, right? I mean, like, these are two sides to the same coin.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot that filters through identity. And I also think from the liberal side, there are charges of elitism. I think those charges are fair. Like from Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables or whatever she said. And there was a lot of analysis post Trump's election about the uneducated white male vote. And a lot of my family members who are working class people who didn't go to college took particular offense to that. And again, from my perspective, I'm like, well, it's just a measure of people who have degrees or don't have degrees. It's not a value judgment, but it sounds like a value judgment.
Right. The way it's phrased. It's phrased.
Yeah.
I have to
so
there's say that I want to shift that sort of conversation. Go ahead. No, go ahead, Jaime.
Go ahead. Yeah, I'm done.
Sorry, I think you were frozen and I wasn't sure if you were talking. But what you said about degrees versus not having degrees, I would like that public conversation to shift, because I dropped out of college because I hated it, and I had ADHD that I wasn't medicated, and it was not like the place for me to learn at the time. So like, and I come from a union family, like my grandpa's a steel worker, I'm from the Rust Belt, like, so, you know, publicly, if people stopped like equating education with like higher education, it would be fantastic, and maybe everyone wouldn't be accused of being an elitist, because you know, that's not necessarily like how it ends up translating, you know.
Yeah.
I know brilliant people who do not even have a high school education. Brilliant people, excellent critical thinkers. And I'm surrounded by educated idiots all the time.
Yeah, like in our faculty meetings. I mean, what?
Not our faculty meetings.
Not our faculty meetings.
Not
Our department's
our
amazing.
meetings.
But yeah, and people will cite that too. Is that I know
You have
people with a
colleagues
college
watching
degree,
this, just so you know.
yeah, or a
They're the
master's
smart
degree
ones.
who don't know anything, and then I have friends who are high school dropouts, and so I mean, it's just having a credential is such an easy way to measure it and sort people. And it was easier to sort people into those who can think critically and those who can't, because some people, you know, take a rocket ship through grad school and they speed run through their masters and they get some sort of fast PhD and they can't think critically, and they've got all the pieces of paper on the wall, but they end up being pawns because they can't sort through information. You know, they never learned to dissect and think with that scientific mind. But we need like a better way to measure that.
Yeah.
So how do you think that the average person though can build those skills? Because
that's
like
a
kind
great
of
question.
right.
I would say it's just a matter of staying open-minded and, you know, like really making sure that you're getting a variety of opinions and analysis. Knowing the difference between opinions and analysis is important. You know, when I think about the people I know who are quote unquote uneducated, but who are super brilliant, they're people who approach things with an open mind and, you know, really do the work with an open mind. So they start with the question and then, you know, like look for the answer. And you don't always have to read, you know, academic articles. You can read a breakdown of that. But are you know, like who's breaking that down for you? You can watch a 2-minute YouTube video, but who, you know, like, but do the extra, like follow the steps down to see who is in charge of that video. Where is that coming from?
Right.
And I think the challenge is for everyone, myself included, right, is to like get past that initial confirmation bias. It says, I found the thing that supports what I already want to hear.
It makes me feel great, makes me feel like a winner. Yeah.
Yeah. And to really do that work and like, who is this? Where is this coming from? What are the alternatives? And this is what I tell my students too, you know, in my class is, you know, like my goal is not to change your mind or to change how you think or feel. My goal is to present, you know, a series of informational points to you. And you may very well keep the same opinion and the same perspective that you had before, but you will have a deeper understanding of why other people feel differently. That's intelligence, right? Like I have on my syllabi, like it's the mark of an educated mind to understand a perspective without necessarily taking it on. That's not exactly the quote. Aristotle didn't quite talk that way. But that's the idea. Like we need to, you know, like be able to look at things from multiple perspectives and really do that work. And not just stop when we get to the thing that we agree with. And we may still end up agreeing with that thing, but we have a broader understanding of why other people don't agree with that thing.
Yeah, you know, we've all seen probably that media bias chart, which has, you know, on the far right and far left. And I've used that to have a discussion about where we get our news and our information from. Because and someone earlier mentioned that Fox News is now considered too liberal because they're doing it in reverse. I don't like what Fox News is saying. So they start retreating to news to the right of Fox News to find their safety, their safe space and their comfort zone. And they keep retreating until now you're just getting your news from Alex Jones or from the one politician that you believe. And so if you're looking at both sides and you have, I'm going to listen to MSNBC and Fox News and try to watch them equally, you're going to get exposure to both sides. I mean, ideally, you're looking at, you know, Politico and Reuters and some of those that are more, the AP that are more in the middle. But that's uncomfortable because you hear stuff you don't like. You know, you see that this policy from Biden was, I don't want to read about how Biden botch the Afghanistan response as someone who really loves Biden, not me, just a person in general. And so you shift to an article that's from the, more left leaning that ignores some of the things he could have done, obviously, to make it more smooth, right? So we retreat to those corners. So I think having a broader, not even having to get into the scientific literature, a broader diet of what we consume in terms of media kind of sets you up for more success. But that gets to the kind of psychological level of it. It's hard to sit there and read stuff that makes you uncomfortable, that this policy that I thought would be good is not working. I don't like that. That ruins my day. I'm just drinking my coffee, trying to read a quick clickbaity headline and go about my day feeling like a winner. And so it's hard to read those kinds of things that challenge us. We don't like to be challenged.
I think part of it with the media, that media graphic that y'all are talking about, some of it I take a little bit of issue with, because I feel like some things are like too far. They're like, it's over here on the left. And I'm like, but their foreign policy articles are like 100% on point. Like, you don't like them here in the United States. But even like The Hill, which is supposedly more conservative, I read tons of articles from The Hill. Like, you just have to know who's writing it. Like, there are people who, are, I guess, as impartial as you could be, or, there are liberal people who write for The Hill. I mean, they have to publish some folks who are on the left, and there have been quite many articles published by moderate to right leaning, allegedly, news articles. And if you find an author who actually knows what they're talking about, you may find that the article is actually true, or not true, but aligns with your beliefs. So one way or the other,
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, is that those people, like I think his name's George Will, just constant conservative author, political advisor, I'm not sure what his actual pedigree is. And he's slowly getting kicked out of the Republican Party for opposing, the radical side. And so they're kicking these people out. And that's the whole never Trumper rhinos. And so they're
job on CNN soon.
They're like congregating, and it's the herd is thinning, and people are slowly defecting, and they're retreating into this corner. And I mean, hopefully we've seen the worst of it. I don't think we have yet, but that's the problem, is that, and how do we stop that, that thing that's in motion?
We have a lot of Facebook questions, like quite a few. So I'm gonna start with that, so we can make sure we answer some of these, because they're good. So Damien's is first, and he wants to know what Jaime and what Matt think about the online attacks against what they're calling critical race theory in public schools. So forget the actual critical race theory that is in law school and in philosophy. What they're saying is CRT in public schools. It seems suspiciously similar to the attacks on Afrocentricity in the mid-90s. What's your take on that, Jaime?
Well, a good question, and timely, because I was just part of an event last night where we talked about critical race theory, though that focused more in higher ed. And really, I mean, my question, which sounds a little bit rhetorical, but I also mean very seriously, like, is critical race theory really taught in K through 12
No,
education?
It's not.
My answer would probably be no. And watching the debates, it's clear most people don't have an understanding of what critical race theory actually is. But that's not really the point, is it? And again, like it's like, if I come at this from an academic standpoint, like, well, you don't know what critical race theory is. Like, A, it's missing the point. B, it sounds elitist, and it's confirming like biases like they have against me and my actions against them, right? So like, that's just not really the approach. The best way to handle that is to like really like think about like what is people's concern about this. And there are a number of like concerns, some of which are probably well-intentioned, and some of which really are just about anxiety that white people have about being decentered.
Yes.
I think it's largely that, and that's hard to placate. And I'm not saying we should, but there's some of those concerns are probably somewhat well maybe well-intentioned isn't the right word, but you know, like people don't want their kids to be made to feel bad at school, and you know, or something like that. I'm like, is anybody really doing that?
That's the propaganda, though, is that they're told that this is going to be the annihilation of the white identity and white race, and that kids are going to be made to feel like that they are the constant oppressors, and that's what teachers are going to be forcing into fifth graders' faces, and they have to accept that and cry and say we're sorry. That's the vision that critical race theorists want. Like, I'm sorry, what was that? I must have missed that in my experience with it. You know, in some ways I've seen it framed too is really scary. We don't want to hear anything about white privilege or advantage or inequality or implicit bias, things that we have studied and have measured and know exist. You know, disparities in policing, whether it's, you know, deliberate racial profiling or what we call like incidental or accidental, don't really like that term, but accidental racial profiling, where you're looking at certain neighborhoods and you happen to have your patrol car in your eyes and your camera facing in that direction, metaphorically speaking, and you tend to capture more crime that's occurring in those neighborhoods. That's a critical perspective, is saying, why are we looking at those neighborhoods to begin with? While we're looking there, we're missing what's happening across town in the mixed race neighborhood or the white middle class neighborhood. And that falls under the heading of critical race theory, which for some reason people don't want anyone talking about. Why? That's, you know, that's baked into our society, this inequality. And we don't want to talk about that because it's uncovering something that makes us uncomfortable. So let's kill it and stop talking about it. Let's ban it.
But I will say, you know, and I think my message to someone who would want to have, you know, like who was concerned about critical race theory and who would want to have that conversation with me, what I would say is, by being like, all we want people who support critical race theory is to be honest about our history.
Perfect.
And some of that is uncomfortable.
Yes.
It just is. It just is. But no one benefits from glossing over those uncomfortable parts. We all benefit from being honest. And we know this from our personal lives. Like, we know this. Like, if you have a problem with yourself, if you have a problem in a relationship, right, you have to be honest about that to get to a better point. Like, if you continue, and I'll say, like we know, because like anyone who's been alive for any period of time has had a problem, like really, like with themselves, like not just start there, because you know that is our primary relationship, and you know, and if you're doing something that is harmful to yourself or unhealthy to yourself, or that is just like causing you complications, like you have to be honest with yourself and look at your behavior and be like, man, I keep messing up. Why? And it's like, oh, well, because I have this pattern of behavior that, and maybe it was a coping mechanism that got you through a hard time before. But you're like, that got me through this time, but it's not getting me through this time. I need to be honest with myself and make that change. Like, so even individually, if you're in a relationship, a friendship, and you have a problem with that friend, with that partner, lover, whatever, like, you got to talk about that. Like, you got to be honest about that before you can get to a better place. You want to save your marriage? Like, you don't do that by lying to each other, really, right? So if we think about that, like historically, if we think about that, like in our country, like we're not going to get to a better place by pretending things didn't exist. Like, we're going to get to a better place by being honest.
Acknowledge the harm, whether you committed the harm or not. The harm needs to be acknowledged. And I'm going to plug the critical race theory discussion that we had with Dr. Aaron Griffin and two professors from Kruger and FMU. So Dr. Aaron Griffin was from Colorado. He's the not vice principal, I'm sorry. He was in charge of diversity and inclusion at the Denver public school systems. He used to be a principal. And that was a fantastic discussion. And if you haven't watched it, it is probably, no offense to anybody, but my favorite one that I've been a part of, because they were all just so fantastic.
I need to watch that.
It's really good. I'll send you the link. And it's really good. It's on Facebook. So anyone watching on a different platform, it's only on Facebook. It did not get transferred over to YouTube. He mentioned, so this is not like his words, these are my words, but you send your kids to public school, do you trust their teachers or not? Like, they're going to be sensitive in these important cultural conversations. No one is going to make a child cry, okay? And no one's going to make a child feel bad. Like, there are ways to discuss things that are age appropriate. And that's what they're going to do. That's what your public school teachers are trained to do. And if you are worried about your kid's teacher, like harming them emotionally, then like, why do you have your kids in school? Like, I personally, I don't get it. There's a right way to do it. The teachers know, they should know how to do it.
But then we're back to trust in institutions.
There we go.
Right?
I know.
Which is not that different from like our conversation.
It all circles back around.
I saw on Facebook where this one teacher yelled at a kid and the kid was crying, and it happened. And the teacher was rightfully fired because they had a mental breakdown and went on some, anti-Trump rant and made some kid, and like, you are fired. That is not what you're supposed to do.
Right.
One teacher out of thousands and thousands of teachers.
Yeah.
I think, the only thing I'll add, because y'all have already addressed it, is, we do have to acknowledge the ugly history. And we've joked that, what would a social problems textbook look like in an era where we can't talk about critical race theory? You turn to the chapter on race, ethnicity, and it's one chapter. Everyone is judged by the content of their character. And you flip the page and you go, that's it? That's the chapter on social problems?
Yeah.
Yes, that's all we're allowed to talk about because some politicians don't want people to be uncomfortable. So we can't talk about all these things we study. Everyone go out and just be yourselves in our society, regardless of your skin color. Amen. That's the end of it. Like, what? Yeah. That's ridiculous. But that's kind of like what they're almost arguing for. Don't talk about that or that. Can't talk about that. Please don't use those stats. Don't talk about those studies. Don't use those terms.
And I do think it's somewhat ironic that this is coming from the same people who rail against cancel culture.
Yeah.
And censorship.
Yeah. Right.
But they want to censor our history. So that is it. That was a good question, Damien. Thank you for asking that. And it sparked a really good little sub chat here. We have a few more to get to before our time is up. So let's see here. Jenny has a good one, and this actually I would like Sydney and Brynne to also answer this as students, because this pertains to professors and students. So the question is that Jenny was actually just told today in class that she did not present both sides of an issue, and she's sitting there like, there is no other side. These are just the facts. So how do you combat this in the classroom? How would you, or how do you respond to those types of comments? And then I'll add for Brynne and Sydney, like, what would you want to hear from your professor? So someone jump in. Matt's thinking, so not Matt, someone else jump in.
No, I think for a lot of people, like that's how they've been trained to approach teaching students to write. And I think for a lot of professors who want to avoid being put in the political spotlight, that's how they encourage their students to write. And I think it's, and especially for professors who might be contingent faculty or might be untenured, I think that is a way for them to allow students to practice their writing and avoid, like putting themselves out there in a way. And I also think and I get as an instructor, like it is challenging because you want to teach students to weigh evidence, but it's really, really hard to do that in the short amount of time that you have with students and the short assignments that you can do with them. So, and it's hard for me to give advice to a student because to some degree, if that's what your professor wants, like one way to deal with it is just to do the assignment. I mean, you can always find another side somewhere. But I think it might be worth having a conversation to say, like, there is a clear consensus on this issue. What other side do you want me to have? Like, or like in your paper, like, I mean, you can say like, well, there are alternate opinions, there are alternate perspectives on this issue, because there are always alternate perspectives, but they're not part of the scientific consensus. They're not part of, what people who know and understand this issue believe, and here's why. So there are kind of like potentially some sneaky ways around that where you're still technically covering alternative viewpoints, but you're not necessarily holding both sides equally. I would like students to take that path because it's a more intellectually challenging path, to acknowledge like alternative opinions and alternative perspectives do exist, but they're not part of the mainstream. They're not part of the consensus, and here's why.
Right. Brynne?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. My phone is on 4%, so I hope that I don't go away.
Yes.
So that's actually a really hard question, because my first thought was, hopefully my professor sees the facts, and like maybe there's not exactly a opposing this, but there are facts. And it's also hard because, well, I'm actually really bad at, if I'm writing a research paper or like, I stick to my own opinion a lot. Also hard. Well, I'm actually really bad at, if I'm writing a research paper or. Wait, do y'all hear me right now?
I hear both of you.
Okay, that's so weird. Yeah, I'm hearing. Here, let me see if this helps. How's that? Wait, do y'all hear me right now?
No, we're still echoing. Unplug your headphones, maybe.
Yeah, I'm hearing. Here, let me see if this helps. Wait, now I can't hear. Do what?
No, we're still echoing. I can hear you talk. Your phone
Somebody
might be
else can
melting
talk.
down.
There's something
You're
wrong
fine.
with my phone.
You are fine. Matt, go ahead. Save the day.
Let me unmute. Yeah, I think she's like stuck in a loop.
Yeah.
like an inception loop. I think, for me, and I saw that comment come up for Jenny, I find that really frustrating too, because for some things where there is not consensus, you do present the research. Gun violence, does the presence of guns lead to more crime or less crime? There's, depending on what level of analysis you're looking at, there's some says one or the other anyway. So then there's others where it's clear, like back to the death penalty. What's the other side? The other side is that the death penalty deters criminals because they're scared of getting killed by the state. That's the other side. There's absolutely zero evidence to support that, but that's the other side. Can we move on? Mm-hmm. It's such an awkward position as a professor to be like, well, I can't imagine the people in marine science or climatologists who say, now let's look at the other side. Some people think this. However, all the research says this. Like that's the false balance down all of it. And now I hear myself. That's weird. So, is she gone? Anyway, so yeah, it's opinion. The two sides are opinion versus the sides with evidence. And in some cases, there's evidence for both sides. And that's the really good stuff. This study showed this, but then another study showed this. Better methodology makes us think it's probably this. We're hoping we can get a longitudinal sample, which will allow us to get at this phenomenon, blah, blah, blah. Like that's the good stuff, but that seems like pretty rare. Most of the time we're kind of on one side or the other. Is everybody coming back in? Did I stall long enough?
I think Sydney's joining again. Maybe she's having computer problems.
Yes.
Hi.
There she is.
I had such good Wi-Fi issues. Oh my gosh.
Okay. So as a student, what would you want your professor to, I guess, do in the situation where one of your classmates is just like, hey, I didn't hear both sides of that issue, What do you think is the right response?
I think that a lot of the time, it's not that we're stubborn or we don't want to say the other side per se, but I think we're unaware. So I think the professor should bring attention to why we should be bringing that up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, it's definitely hard, and I think you guys have a hard campus to work with.
Yeah.
I would say too, if you're in a situation where someone is just really you must present both sides, what is the other side? I think they're, and I think the death penalty is a good example. And way earlier, Matt, you said something about you kind of casually inserted the word moral, right? And this is the issue, because when it comes to a debate around the death penalty, people who support the death penalty, they don't care if it's a deterrent. They're taking a moral position that
right.
Someone who has taken a life, their life should be taken.
Yeah.
Whether it's a deterrent or not really makes little difference to them.
Yeah.
So I think
two different arguments. One is you want the evidence,
mm-hmm.
zero deterrent. you can still support the death penalty on the grounds of eye for an eye, whatever your religious tradition or faith tradition tells you. That's a separate argument, but you have to support it knowing that it's not going to deter other people or save any lives. It's just a moral decision.
I think it also brings up the fact too that like, did you hear my side though? Like, I know you want to talk about your side, but are you listening to what I have to say?
Yeah.
People want to be heard.
Yep.
Yes, that's a good one. I like that.
And when it comes to morals, I mean, everyone's morals are different. So if you are pro-life for pro-birth, but we'll say for this conversation right now, pro-life for fetuses, but you are for the death penalty, why did their life not matter? I mean, so I don't know. I mean, my morals are going to be different than your morals, and my morals say that the death penalty is not a good thing. You know what I mean? Like so if someone did that, if someone brought that up to me, I would be like, okay, well, that's your opinion, but your morals are not everyone's morals. So you can't say it's moral. Like, I don't know. It's hard. Some people don't want to have, I guess, logical conversations. And I know from my experience working on campaigns, like convincing people to vote for candidates, that usually emotional outreach is what has been shown to work. People respond to emotions. But I'm actually, and this is not like scientific, this is anecdotal, what I'm about to say, I'm finding that doesn't even work anymore. Like, I don't see anyone responding to emotions when, you know, they see someone died from COVID, or they see someone who, you know, that they know that died, or their friend's husband died, right? Like, they have no feeling of emotion for that. It doesn't strike any chord with them. They're operating, I think, based off of fear. So, which is an emotion, but it's not the way to change their opinion.
Yeah.
I think with that, like I see people's defense mechanisms kicking in related to fear. And this might seem like an odd comparison, but, you know, like I think about it like when you have a person, you know, like who's victim blaming someone who might have been involved in a sexual assault or, you know, dating violence, partner violence situation. And they're like, I would never be wearing that. I would never be in that place at that time, doing that thing with that person. And all of these are defense mechanisms. And that's not a justification for victim blaming at all, but it's understanding where that comes from. And I think, you know, there's something similar happening with COVID that like shuts down like that. It's a defense mechanism because things are so scary, so overwhelming, so uncertain.
The anxiety.
Yeah. And I think like there's that distance. I have seen those appeals work in different ways, like environmentally, it's really interesting around like climate change. If you can get appeals to like not just people's emotions, but their different values. Like if you can say, we need to have more fuel efficient cars because it helps national security and is more patriotic, right then. And I remember the 2004 election, probably 2004, no, it had to be 8 because it was McCain. And I remember a sharp uptick and seeing like McCain bumper stickers on like Priuses. But it was around a time where like wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were pushing up fuel prices, and people were talking about fuel consumption as a matter of national security. So like then you have like all of these complicated reasons a person might buy a Prius, but also like Prius is associated with liberalism. So they're going to put that McCain sticker on there. Right. So, you know, and even just talking with people around here, like people around here are much more open, like conservative people are much more open to the idea of climate change being real. Like there still might be some disagreement on to what extent it's human caused. Even that's like, you know,
what we should do about it.
Exactly. Like we can agree on the problem.
So that's why.
The solution. But you know, like my family back in the Midwest, they're like, "Oh no, climate change, it's a hoax."
Because they're not impacted by it immediately.
we're seeing sea level rise. We get the hurricanes, like we get the flooding, like we know it. So yeah, so I think that there are some emotional appeals that can work, but I think with COVID, it's literally fear of life and death. And I think people are throwing up those defenses so quickly.
Here's another, I know we're almost out of time, but here's another thing that piggybacks off that, which is insane. I meant to mention this earlier. It gets back to fear and the defense mechanisms in our tribes. And I think I don't know if it was in our shared document, a sociologist, Dartmouth, Brooke Harrington, maybe I don't have the name right, but that, and I think it was Missouri, where people are getting vaccinated in disguise. And they set up these hospitals set up back rooms where people could go in and out of the hospital to get vaccinated without being seen. And so as a sociologist, she was, asking people questions, and it was out of fear of being called a traitor or a defector by their reference group. So the fear of COVID and seeing people in your network die is causing people to defect and listen to science and get vaccinated and take precautions. But I mean, think about what they're having to do, hiding it from your spouse or your family or your coworkers because you don't want them to criticize you. Instead of just saying, yeah, I got the vaccine. It's personal choice. Leave me alone. They're hiding that decision. And what a terrible position to be in to try to empathize if that's what you have to do. A mom of 3 who sneaks off to go get vaccinated because she doesn't want to be like her friend that died and left 4 kids behind. You see these stories. And the husband's furious. Like, what a terrible position to find yourself in. So I think there's some room for some sympathy that they're in this position, and not just to be like, oh, what's wrong with you? You guys are idiots, or you're stupid, or you're ignorant. Yeah. It's so much more complicated than that. And certainly some of them are aggressively anti this or that. And that's, you want to like put on your gloves and duke it out with them. That's different. But some of them are just kind of carried along with this movement, and they're at risk because of the current moment, their tribal beliefs. Anyway.
Yeah.
No, I know we're out of time.
No, you're fine. I'm just looking to see if there's one last question. I feel like Renee asked one. Let me see. Yeah, she asked like what we could do to explain it better to the lay person and to talk to our friends and family and encourage them. But I feel like we did cover that a little bit. So I don't know if you have like any last thoughts that like sum up your ideas of how to have like factual conversations with people who might be resistant. Let's not even like put the aggressive anti-vaxxers in there who, are kind of the ones I would say that are like the jerks who are spreading like all kinds of craziness. Let's just put it on the people who are like considering, confused, maybe scared. Like, how would you have a conversation with them that you hope would be productive?
I would say let them lead the conversation, like start by like gently exploring what their concerns are, resist the urge to just hammer back with a bunch of facts, but acknowledge their concerns, acknowledge that, like things are scary, like the vaccine, but like there are like soft ways, like this is about finesse, right? Like there are soft ways to address people's concerns. And if they're concerned that, like, well, it seems, like everything happens so fast. Like, well, yes, like it does seem like it happened fast, but this vaccine for coronaviruses has actually been researched for nearly 20 years. But let them lead in their concerns and then gently offer, here's another way to think about that. But you can't convince the person. You can only give them the information that they need to make up their own mind.
I echo that, obviously. And also I think asking questions. One thing that I have been using recently to get people to think about it is that Alabama, for the first time ever, had more deaths than births in the past year because of COVID. And not using that as so there, I'm right, but saying that is, we keep using this word, that is literally unprecedented. So what do you think about that? Because, a lot of people, they're counting heart attacks as COVID, or they're counting cancer as COVID. There's something going on, and it's worse in Alabama. They're telling us it's COVID, but more people died than were born. I'll throw up the graph in the chat, but also law enforcement deaths in the past 2 years have skyrocketed. And it's not because of the usual causes, automobile accidents or gunfire. It's because of COVID. And so you see this giant spike. And so just pointing at the data and saying there's no way to explain that except to recognize this is real. And yes, that's scary, but what are we going to do about it? Because there's such a denial that it's even happening. The denial of the data, denial of objective empirical evidence. And I think, like Jaime said, going, why don't you follow the empirical evidence? Like that's then the conversation's over. Then it's Fauci and Biden mouthing and like, look, I'm getting my shot. You should too. That's worthless. But trying to have a conversation and ask questions over and over, the soft way is the only way to make little inroads. And it might not change their mind immediately, but it will at least give them a path to drift towards consensus.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, this was definitely a good discussion, albeit a heavy discussion. And there is just so much that, you could cover in something like this. So we'll have to schedule another one for maybe a month or two out to take on, different little avenues of this type of thinking. But before we wrap up, I just want to mention to everyone that we are having a rally for abortion justice Saturday. It is at Chapin Park in Myrtle Beach. It starts, the coffee hour starts at 9:30. Nola's Stuffed Snowballs will be there to provide everyone with free coffee, cold brew, and hot chocolate. And then the march portion starts at 10, and then the rally portion with speakers and music and poetry starts at 10:30. I hope to have the whole thing wrapped up by 12:30. There are other things to do on Saturday that I will let y'all know about there at the event, suggestions for what you can, do to support the rest of the day. There's quite a few things happening. And if you need any more information about this, feel free to reach out to us on Instagram or on Facebook, or you can email us at gsat2020@gmail.com. Jaime will be one of our, I don't know what side you're on to whoever's watching, but right now she's on this side. Jaime will be one of our speakers. So we are looking forward to hearing from her again. And she's beauties and brains, just so you all know. It's not just beauty. I just wanted
Are you going to put her on a coffee
dip
retainer?
that. What?
Is she going to be on a coffee retainer though?
She's going to be on a margarita retainer.
There you go.
That's a better deal. That's a better deal.
And I will say, if you're looking for something to do after the rally, there is a Pride Festival at Market Common. So, rally, then party. So there you go.
There is, and there's a lot of other things happening, like wherever you live, like there's stuff in Surfside. Valor Park in the Market Common is not far from Chapin. It's about 10 minutes away. There also is a rally protest really at Whittemore Park Middle School, I believe is where it was moved to, in Conway, in support of a man who was murdered by the South Carolina State Police. You can look up, his name is Tristan Vereen, and they are holding that on Saturday, and it's not going to end until 3. So you can come to our event, and then if you want to make the drive to Conway, if you're able to, if you live out that way, I would encourage you to go support that. Pride will be going on all night. I think it's going on until at least the evening. So there's also a jerk festival on Broadway Street. Like there's tons of things happening. So we hope you come out and have a fun-filled day. It is family friendly. Yes, it is family friendly. You can bring your kids to the abortion rally. I'm bringing my oldest daughter, who is 7. So, there is nothing to be afraid of if you need to bring your children. Other than that, we will have porta potties this year. So yay on that. We've never been able to provide them in the past. Planned Parenthood sponsored some yard signs for us, so we'll have those. We have t-shirts. It's going to be a good time. So please come on out and support us and support the fight for abortion justice. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Brynne. And thank you, Sydney, for coming in and joining us. We have no future live streams planned at this time, but check back maybe next week and we'll have some stuff on the schedule. So thank you all.
Yeah, I'll be here next week.
Matt will be here every week until Christmas. He needs to go ahead and plan right now. So pencil it in.
I'm going to renegotiate my contract to include bourbon.
Now you're talking.
Okay, bourbon. Yeah, we can do bourbon.
All right. Thank
Thank
you all.
you
I
guys.
enjoyed
Have
it.
a good night,
Thanks,
everybody.
Ashlyn.
Bye.
Thanks, Sydney. Thanks, Brynne.
Yeah.